So since Ralph made a little snarky remark about Druid radar, I want to show that we don't really disagree, and that Druid radar expresses non-predictability. When I was living out here in 1976, running Lindisfarne in between Southampton and Sag Harbor, I had a vision, and let me explain about metacognitive states. You can, without use of drugs, through yoga and meditation, move to a state of consciousness where, like lucid dreaming, you can see your thoughts, think visually, move into hieroglyphic thinking, and go into a metacognitive domain where things that are separate in training and education become fused in the creative process. This is the same kind of creative process that the novel uses, that when I write a novel, I would go do that way, or a poem, or an essay. And so Courtney was always impressed that I wrote the curricular essay in a week, but I wrote it the same way I would write a poem or I would write a novel with these interlocking threads and the rest of it. So in 1976, I had a vision of New York underwater, and I was standing on the Jersey headlines looking toward Manhattan, and I saw the water up to the 6th story, and I said to myself in this kind of dream state, lucid dreaming, call it whatever you like, New York is at peace with nature as she never was in life. And so that was a kind of dream shamanic state. These, I have these Irish genes, I guess, that these recidivist shamanic talents are still in the blood, because the burning of the witches didn't extend to Ireland. And so the gene pool was preserved with this kind of archaic mentality, and so we, passed it on. So you Anglo-Saxons have been screwed, sorry. So late at night as a senior, I can't sleep between 2 and 4, so I surf YouTube as a kind of Jungian collective unconsciousness to tune into the dreaming mind of the planet. There's everything there, extraterrestrials invading of grays and reptilians, and the Illuminati are taking over the world banks, and the Midwest is really big into conspiracy theory. But you have to remember, conspiracy theory really is just an epistemological cartoon. It's a way of knowing, but you can't ignore them, because when you don't know what's really happening, you generate this kind of conspiracy to connect the dots out of relieving your own existential angst and insecurity. So it doesn't mean that it's totally wrong. It's obviously mad, but madness too is a kind of poetry that R.D. Laing taught us how to look at madness in a different way. So there were all these prophecies in YouTube that on December 21st, 2012, the Earth's magnetic field would reverse, the crust of the Earth would slip, the whole equator and the whole arrangement would go cockywoggle, and we would have this great apocalyptic event. Edgar Cayce was another kind of prophet who predicted New York would have an earthquake in the 90s and be, wiped out, and LA would have an earthquake and slip into the sea. None of these things happened. This is because prophets should never make predictions, because they're trying to tell the time with myth, and that's a category mistake. That's not how myth operates as a description of culture. So all of these things are a sensitivity to quantum potential states. And when you're a system, culture is not homeostasis, it's homeoresis. And as it flows through time, there are these quantum potential states of possibilities, and some have more increasing probability. But the further you move into it, the more your probability states and quantum potential states decline, and one becomes real. And as that happens in Stuart Kauffman's complex dynamical systems model, it collapses into a kind of classical Newtonian kind of system of cause and effect. But before that, it's not in a linear causal effect, it's a complex adaptive system, and it operates in kind of cyclical causality. So the observer actually changes the system, which is in the Bible. I think Jonah and the whale predicted all kinds of things that didn't happen, and that was a good thing, so that the prophecies were attended to and there were changes. So culture, to observe the system and interact with it, is to change it. And so consciousness is an effective agent in the constitution of reality. It isn't split between subjectivity and objectivity. It isn't the case that physics is true and art is false. Art, especially in the lectures I give to the seniors here on Paleolithic cave art, is a cognitive system. And the evolution of consciousness happened effectively expressed through art. So this split between this is real because we can write it in an equation and this is just Irish bullshit, that's completely wrong. There is, bullshit is necessary for fertility and recycling, and it's a good thing, not a bad thing. So at any rate, I wanted to explain that Druid radar is just an imaginative way of using the creative process, but it is a chaotic system. It is totally non-predictable, and every prophet who opens his mouth and gives you a date is always going to be wrong. It just doesn't work that way. So you can catalog all the prophecies, and none of them happen. Here it is beyond 2012, and we're all here. So that said, I want to agree with Ralph again. That sustainability is the wrong word. Sustainability means you're holding on to sustain something. But what I learned from your lecture, Professor Lena, is the cosmic evolution, that the whole universe is moving in time. Our body is homeoresis, not homeostasis. The immune system is a dialogue with the environment and is constantly changing antigens and antibodies and all of that. And the metabolic system is exchanging gases and respiration and burning ATP in the cells, and that's an interlocked, structural, coupled system. So you have a complex dynamical system that can't possibly be stopped in time and said, let's just hold on to this. We want it always to be the American dream and not, the third world. Those splits are going to change. So what I want to talk about now is participatory coevolution. That what we have to do in the mission that Courtney set up about training the world leaders is to be sensitive to we're living in an era of catastrophe. And so how we interact, we can have kind of rational global management like the Club of Rome, and that obviously is not going to work because it's linear and it's thinks it can control, and the system is chaotic. And so you have to, like Aikido in Japanese culture, you have to move with the force of the environment and move back with it in a kind of Taoist cyclicity, to use both Japanese and Chinese cultures. So what we're trying to do is understand a new structural coupling of culture and the environment, but not in this kind of split of nature and nurture, which is the old paradigm. So that said, I did, at Courtney's request, create a PowerPoint and called it Sustainability Thread in the Ross School Spiral Curriculum. Now, what you have to understand about the Ross School is at its core, it is a complex dynamical system of the three-body problem: Ralph, me, and Courtney. And sometimes it's a very turbulent system, as Courtney will attest. And so if you take out any one of us, you don't get the curriculum. Sure, I wrote the thing in isolation, the essay you have in your folder, but Courtney added the senior product, nutrition, wellness, meditation, Tai Chi and yoga, and all of these elements of health and wellness, and understood from the very beginning when we all got together at the first summer academy in '95, I think, and she was scribbling on a napkin in the classical way and creating an iconic way of thinking about the spiral curriculum. And her spiral works this way. My spiral works this way, which if you take both spirals, you get Yeats's two gyres, and it's an ancient Sufi paradigm. So one needs to think in both. Mine goes this way because evolution is going through cycles of millions of years and going through a logarithmic spiral where change goes from millennia to centuries to decades to years, and in the senior year it reaches its singularity of the transition of an adolescent to an adult. And we think metacognitively and reflect on the recapitulation of the spiral. So we begin to think in a new way of metahistory. And so it's not really cultural history that we teach here, it's cultural phenomenology. And this is unique to the Ross School. You go to university and you'll just be specialized. And history is who killed who with what when. So we have the Stone Age when we killed one another with rocks, and we have the Plutonium Age when we kill one another with atom bombs. And that's real masculine boys' history, and that's real, and you can do it in an equation. Girly history is art history, and the girlies get to study nice, touchy-feely stuff and go off to Florence and collect paintings, teach their husbands how to do interior decoration and what art to have in the home. That kind of that suburban culture is precisely what we're not. We're teaching not cultural history, how to be enlightened consumers. We're teaching cultural phenomenology, and that embraces everything from quantum mechanics to astrophysics to chaos dynamics. But the first three-body system is the three of us, and this 20-year experience has been incredible, and we have all grown to be more than we were when we got together. I began studying complex dynamical systems in my honors thesis at Pomona in terms of Gregory Bateson's theory of cyclical causality. And he was the first one to begin working in this movement with the MIT gang of von Neumann and others. And they began to articulate what was cybernetics, which became Jay Forrester, and the Meadows at MIT, whom I met. I was at MIT then. And then it became, in the 80s, the chaos dynamics revolution at Santa Cruz. So in the history of knowledge, there's been an evolution of these sciences moving toward increasing integration and increasing complexity. And the lab school that Courtney set up, and it was her vision of integration that brought all these elements together. This is one place that is doing the next step. And you would think it would be at MIT or Princeton, but no, it's happening here at the Ross School. So this is a tremendously exciting moment for you as teachers and for all of us. But it all comes through a kind of teamwork, a noetic polity, and not just singular achievements. So I noticed when I was working on the curriculum that the German-Swiss cultural historian Jean Gebser had 5 structures of consciousness: archaic, magical, mythic, mental, and integral. We at Ross are working at this level of the integral. But I noticed, having taught in Toronto and gone to Marshall McLuhan's Coach House meetings, that his structure was isomorphic. There was oral culture, imagistic, script, print, and then electronic. So my addition to McLuhan and Gebser was to say that Foucault in the Archéologie de Savoir didn't really go deep enough. He said in the Archéologie de Savoir that philology and economics had at their root structure a common cognitive structure that he called an episteme. But Foucault was Paris 1968, which was a very highly politicized movement and generational shift in European culture. So everything was seen in terms of power, the power of the asylum, the power of the hospital, and everything was locked on that. And I thought, no, he hasn't gone deep enough. There's a deep structure, in Chomsky's terms, where mathematics and literary narrative are isomorphic and part of a deeper structure, a kind of mentality. So I went back to even earlier French scholars of Henri Lévy-Bruhl, who created the book on the primitive mentality. And then Les Analystes, again, a French group, with the world's greatest cultural historian of the 20th century, Fernand Braudel, of the mentality of a whole epoch. And so Braudel said, look, history doesn't work with Napoleon, Alexander the Great. History works in terms of the common man and a shared mentality. So it was the opposite of Carlyle's romantic theory of history as the work of the great man. And so I said the deep structure of art and a culture and mathematics can be seen as artistic mathematical mentalities, the arithmetic, who got so-and-so, the great mother, and arithmetic concepts and the notion of the list. Geometric, the ancient civilizations, riverine to transcontinental and the Silk Road. The algebraic and the shift to code and calligraphy, and the transcontinental to Mediterranean. And then the Galilean dynamical, the shift to modernism and falling bodies. And the new one, again, the French, I mean, notice how important they are. Henri Poincaré practically single-handedly created complex dynamical systems. So this is the last mentality that we're in. Once I attended a meeting at the New York Academy of Sciences, and there were Stuart Kauffman, who's a Lindisfarne Fellow, more of that a little later, and E.O. Wilson. And it was if I was attending a conference in, the 17th century with the birth of the scientific revolution with Descartes and a college of cardinals. And E.O. Wilson, in his consilience, was the idea of reducing everything to a fundamentalist scientific narrative, linear causation. It was the opposite of complex dynamical systems, which is a shame because he's a great scientist with his work on ants, and if anybody should understand complex dynamical systems, it's someone who studied how an ant colony works. But consilience is very linear, and the University of Chicago professor who was at the same conference, I think his name was Breyer, said, well, E.O. Wilson was raised a Christian fundamentalist, and, he got over that, but I wonder, and so he had a sense that the root structure of explanation of Christian fundamentalism had carried on into his application of science. And he said that, I didn't say that. So he noticed something. And Stu Kauffman was trying to speak in terms of complex dynamical systems, and so there were two mentalities present on the stage, the old science and the new science. So Stuart Kauffman was, an avatar of a shift, and Max Planck said that old scientists never change their minds, they just die. And younger scientists come in with a new paradigm. And so T.S. Kuhn taught that people who innovate a new paradigm often are outside the paradigm, outside the science that they change. I've never had any courses in history except freshman Western Civ. So Courtney came to me instead of a professor at Columbia in the Columbia Teachers College. And I never understood why you did that, but at any rate, I was completely outside the system. And Courtney caught my imagination because I kept telling her, no, I was a university professor. I don't know anything about K through 12. You come to the wrong place. And she said, no, I want somebody to rethink the structure of education from K through 12. And I said, wow, now that's a really interesting problem to wrestle with. So I said, yes, and worked on it. And, that was what you've got in the 3-ring folder. But as most historians will say, Thompson's really not a historian. So you can set them up to see the cultural ecology, the mentality, the archetypal object that expresses the mentality, and the focus of identity. Riverine would be arithmetic. The list is we teach it here, how Inanna transferred the arts of civilization, and they describe all the arts of civilization that are carried from one ship to another and go from Erish to Eridu. And so people in this mentality never get bored with lists. I mean, in Buddhism, there are 5 bhumis, 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Path, 28 forms of incorrect mentation. I mean, they adore lists. Next comes the transcontinental. The geometric mentality is expressed by the ceremonial center, and one needs geometry to create these places, from Göbekli Tepe to the pyramids to Anyang in China. And its source, the first source of identity is blood, all children of Abraham. So your name is Yosef ben David, ben meaning a patronymic, son of. And so your identity comes from your tribe. But in the new ceremonial center performing a new worldview with new geometry, your identity is religious. And so all the Sumerians who share similar gods are part of a new identity structure. The next one is Mediterranean, the algebraic mentality, and the esoteric code, the rise of calligraphy, musical notation, medieval allegory, which is a very abstract way of looking that bores modernists. I mean, there's nothing more boring than, Pilgrim's Progress or Le Roman de la Rose, which are very allegorical modes of thinking. And the identity is coming from linguistic, either Latin or Arabic or Mandarin Chinese. The next one is the oceanic with the moving bodies and ballistic currencies and Leibniz mathematics for ballistics, and the emergence of studying motion, which you couldn't resolve in the geometric mentality through Zeno's paradox. So you had to shift to calculus and a whole new mentality. And the new identity begins to be national. And you notice whether it's with Lope de Vega and Calderon, or it's with Corneille and Racine, or it's with Shakespeare, the national theater begins to be a performance of the new linguistic identity that's coming not from a single religion, hence the intense, devastating wars of religion in the 30 Years' War, and in Shakespeare's time as well. Some people feel Shakespeare was a closet Catholic, and so he was celebrating Elizabeth and the Protestant Revolution, but may have been in this cognitive dissonance as a private Catholic, So the poem "Bare Ruined Choirs Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang" means the ruined monasteries by Henry VIII, the sacking of the monasteries. And so this has a whole new mathematical notation, linear causation, and currency and interest in the movement of trade. And so in the geometrical mentality, currency and interest and loans and bills of notation is usury. It's a sin, both for the Catholics and for the Muslims. But in the New World, in the Protestant shift of modernism, it's where the action is. It creates the whole structure of modernization and the emergence of the modern world. Finally, in the mentality we're in, biospheric, we have complex dynamical, and consciousness begins to be the charismatic science that brings together multidisciplinary centers. Some of the first interdisciplinary centers in Dartmouth and at MIT were to study consciousness, like the Wallach and Pitts and the embodied mind, which tried to create a calculus for the nervous system of firing 1, 0. This was all work on psychology that was going on at MIT when I was there in the 60s. And so the new source of identity is planetary and regional. So the more you belong to the planet, notice how the Soviet Union broke up, but I will now make a prediction, Ralph, so I'll try to play prophet. I'll probably be wrong. I think in the next 50 years, the United States will break up, and that you already see these emerging biomes in the heartland where one culture, loves guns and hates gays, and the coasts love gays and, don't want to have guns. So the culture is breaking up into these biomes, 5 of them basically, the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest and Northeast, and the heartland in the Southeast. So it's much more important for a Californian. His relationship to China is stronger than it is to Kansas. And in the East Coast, the relationship to Europe is much more important to me. Ireland and Switzerland and France are much more important to me than Idaho or the Dakotas or some part of America. I feel no kinship whatsoever with Governor Perry of Texas. I mean, he's like a complete alien. But he would see me as some kind of alien that's dropped in and, doesn't like guns and sports and all that macho stuff. Basically, there are 2 kinds of root structures of cultural ecologies. Immanental, where mind is immanent in the system, as in Shinto in Japan, where everything is invested with the kame, and others that are more extractive. A transcendental culture is one that is extractive and does not restore the atmospheric, oceanic, or soil resources upon which it depends. When agriculture becomes an extractive industry, which it was for President Bush, like mining, it becomes locked in a temporal race between order and entropy. In these cultures, God is often seen to be a creator who is transcendent and outside his creation, God the Father. So in the early years of the Raw School, we study matristic cultures. Notice I don't say matriarchal. and divinity is immanent, and the Great Mother is the body of the universe. And so the Native Americans talk about our mother, how can you own land? The land is our mother. So they are nomads, but their identity is the linkage of the large and the little. So we have at our origins, this is why I kept raising this question to you and to you, about lacustrine, because I knew Sir Alister Hardy is, a Whiggy guy who's outside the paradigm, but that doesn't stop me, as you know. And so there is this theory that the complexity of the environment and the hominization of the primates is interesting because it's not just the savanna. And it's this linkage between Lake Como and the resources of water and land that creates this kind of emergent property of the larger brain and bipedalism. Encephalation. So we study in the earlier years this kind of emergent cultural ecology. This is why we use the word cultural ecologies in linkage, and we don't just say culture and nature. And so we have, the sylvan environment and certain kind of social structures. And when you, live in the dense trees like gibbons, you might have a different kind of sexual structure of mating for life and monogamy, because, the competition's not much. The sight lines aren't very long, so your eye can't go roaming because you just see, just one and grab one, and that's your mate for life. But when we come down the trees, it gets really complicated. And suddenly, facial recognition becomes critical to survival, and we have to invent from the compression new forms of structuring reproduction. Some are more sexually dimorphic, with males in defense and females running it through a kind of group dynamic. And the difference between, the chimps and the bonobos, which creates, a different form of sexual structure of using sex to resolve issues and being more matristic in its structure. But those carry on in a kind of throwback way of recidivism, because basically the chimps have survived in today's Republicans and the bonobos are Democrats. Now when you come to this riverine culture, you have here with Homo habilis making the Acheulean fist hatchet, you have an association with water as an important ingredient. So we're a kind of literal culture. We live, just as life, according to Stuart Kauffman, lives at the edge of chaos, we've always lived at the edge, inhabiting the dynamic of the interaction of two cultural ecologies, water and land. We're not just simply, most of the pop narratives of hominization are always talking about the savanna. And I think the one good point that Elaine Morgan and Alister Hardy made was, if that's where we were, the leopards would have taken us, out long ago. Cheetahs can run fast. Even though we're famous for running, they can still run faster than we can. So we had a different organization. So we study these in the early years. My point in all this is there's no hard work to have sustainability in the Ross curriculum, because that's how I thought when I wrote the curriculum. So it's implicate order. It's all there in every single year to develop. Now, in the glacial cultural ecology, you have the force of compression again that's creating clothing and hides and creating shelter. And shelter creates a new opportunity because a big mammoth skull and a femur bone, you hit the skull and it resonates, and suddenly you've got music. So one of the earliest instruments we find are little hollow bone flutes cut with holes that show they had a musical scale. So they're quite advanced. So if you're talking about the evolution of consciousness, you have to take music as a form of cognition and take art very seriously. So this is, again, the split between science is hard and objective, and the humanities are touchy-feely, and subjective is utter nonsense. Here we get the first portraiture and sculpture from Dolny Vestanice, and Dolny Vestanice is living in this hilltop kind of defensive settlement with the environment compressing it. And did you talk about hilltops? Someone of you talked about hilltops as defensive forts, or maybe it was last night at dinner. So Dolny Vestanice would bear that up. So here's an early form in Nice of terra amata, of these two ecosystems being exploited. And here's one in Neolithic in Serbia of Lepenski Vir with showing the kind of shelter and the food from rabbits to fish and a rich source to dwell upon, that because our numbers are small and the environment is larger, then it can be restorative, and the water culture will restore whatever we clutter up. You see again here in the Mesopotamian civilization and the Peruvian emerge at the same time, 3000 BC. We used to think that the Olmecs were the beginning, but they come much, much later. The Caral in Peru is 3000 BC, and here it is right by the river, the Supe River, and here you see a complex cosmology. There are 4-step pyramids, and here is this kind of early kiva form. And my Druid radar, and this is totally irrational, I think, having met Hopi elders in the Southwest who talk about there are 4 worlds of emergence, that what this is performing is the emergence and the 4 worlds, and we're now living, according to the Hopi, in the transition from the 4th world to the 5th. Now, mythic thinking sometimes can be a code for science. And so I always was confused when the Hopi would say, in the 3rd world, humanity lived underground and lived with the ants. And the ants helped us to survive. And then I realized that, as E.O. Wilson and others have shown, the ants create agriculture, and the ants have a society. And if you're thinking of mammals, it is literally true that mammals, burrowing mammals in the Jurassic were small, tiny, and when the dinosaurs left, they could come out and emerge out of their burrowing holes and be protected and grow larger and have a floration of their speciation. And so the myth is telling a story, but in mythic terms, imagistically. It would be like you would say, if you're thinking mythically, the sun god shoots arrows at Mother Earth. Mother Earth hold up shield, knock 'em arrows away. Well, that's describing the radiation in the Van Allen belts, and it's just a different way of thinking. So these metacognitive states still have their value, and atavistically they haven't gone away. They survive in art and music and poetry and crazies like me. So here you have the step pyramid in Sumer. And this, of course, is what we study in the 4th grade. Now, this shows you literally the edge between the wild and the cultured, and the imposition of a geometrical concept onto nature. But when you get sea and maritime expansion, you also get deforestation. They cut down the cedars of Lebanon, and one of the earliest things we study about sustainability is when we read the Gilgamesh epic, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu go out to slay the spirit of the forest. And so what's happening in the myth is a recognition of the implications of this new way of thinking, that man can kill the spirit of nature and dominate. But the Gilgamesh epic is a tragedy because biology has its revenge. Enkidu dies of a wasting disease and not from a heroic death. And death is pushed into the face of Gilgamesh. And so biology has its answer to the hubris of human pride. So this first tragedy of assertion of a disconnected self as the proto-form of tragedy emerges in ancient Sumer and is developed in Greek tragedy, where the hero asserts himself and then experiences the collapse. Now this place here is the Temenos. In the original form of ritual, before they built these things, the women would process and sing an ode, parados, and sacrifice a goat, and then they would sing another ode, the exodos. And so this was a woman's ritual. This is a matristic culture. In the revolution to civilization and the elaboration of the geometric mentality, the men take over and kick out the women, and no actors are allowed who aren't males. So you see this kind of shift from one matristic culture to a patriarchal one there very early on. But the implications are this is related to climate change. All the wood needed for the ships is creating a change in the Mediterranean climate. So deforestation and climate change we don't study in the 12th grade. We begin to study it here very early on. Again, proving that sustainability is implicate in our curriculum from the start. In the algebraic mentality, you have an abstract code in the shift from immanent to transcendent concepts of nature. Allah and God in the Abrahamic religions is transcendent. The poet Omar Khayyam is a mathematician as well. And so there's a fascination of code, and this creates a kind of matrix for what will become the elaboration of the scientific revolution. The Dark Ages ended because of the impact of Islam on Western Europe. At the time of the Crusades, the Europeans are slobs. I mean, they don't even know how to wipe themselves when they go to the bathroom. I mean, when they came to Mexico with Cortez, the first thing the Indians noticed, they were filthy and they stank. So this notion of Europe as the great, transcendent thing and all great things come from Europe, nonsense. The European Dark Ages ended because of the implication of Islam in the convivencia in 12th century Andalus, which gives you this kind of science and engineering from Al-Jazari's book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices from 1206. So when our kids study Islam in the convivencia, obviously they have a different mentality than the people who are watching CNN and are locked in, as Bush was, into a crusader mentality. Our little kids, knew more than the President of the United States. As you switch to the oceanic, you have new forms of, ships carrying coal and creating atmospheric pollution and cannonry. Even though the Chinese created firecrackers, we turned it into gunpowder. And here, British battleships are destroying in the Opium Wars the Chinese junks. Now, we study economies of addiction from right at the get-go with rum and sugar and slavery from the start. And so, or marijuana and cocaine now, and Ciudad Juarez and all of that. So, understanding the linkage between economic expansion, because the British Empire is expanding, but how are they doing it? They're taking their opium from Afghanistan and dumping it in China to get everybody addicted, so that they can move in and get trading cities along the coast. Now, in this shift to a new form of combustion, it creates a new form of pollution, and so you begin to get atmospheric pollution. So often in cultural dynamics, evil is the enunciation of the next level of order, the next level of organization. The Vikings project and create the projection of European civilization from Newfoundland to Iceland to founding Kiev, to founding Dublin, to founding Limerick. And so the Vikings are rape and plunder and destruction of the monasteries, but as they evolve into social democratic democracies, the new level of order and organization becomes such that Oslo now is where the Nobel Prize for Peace comes from, but it was also the place where the raiders and the Vikings came from. So there's a whole shift here, and Michel Serres, again I'm quoting all these French guys, so you should feel pretty good. And Michel Serres has written about the relationship between thermodynamics and Carnot and the paintings of Turner. And so there's a linkage between this new thermodynamic mentality where there's a study not just of light but of heat and transformation. And so this is part of this shift. This is why, with Ralph's design of these integral units, we look at art and science together and have an understanding of complexity that's quite different from the way I was raised, or even presumably the way you were taught in school. But slowly they're catching up with Ross. So cultural systems have their polluting shadows. Civilization has irrigation systems all the way back to Sumer, so that creates soil loss and salinization of the soil. This still goes on in the heartland of America with these center pivots that raise up the water table, and they're draining the Ogallala aquifer, but they're also salinating the soil. So we're turning agriculture into an extractive mining industry, and it's an exact parallel to what Ralph has shown you with the death of the oceans and the fishery. When we have empires, we have deforestation and climate change, which I've already discussed. And with the industrial nation state, we have atmospheric pollution and climate change again. And extinction, which you'll see the movie. And so the sixth extinction is not just of all the animals we're eliminating, we're also involved in that, and so we ourselves are forcing our own extinction. So the sustainability thread in the lower school is kindergarten. We begin with creation myths and vast elemental forces. The first grade, patterns in nature, earth and sky. I have monarchs in the second. That's a mistake. I see you do monarchs in the first grade. So in the second grade, patterns in motion. Here we have patterns in nature. Then we have patterns in motion, which goes through the concept of pulses. Ecologies work through pulses, and our management systems work with linear control. We try to stop forest fires, and actually forests work through germination from intense heat, and so forest fires created by lightning strikes are part of the cycle. Extinction really, if you take a big picture, astrophysics style, catastrophe is how the universe works, catastrophe is how evolution works, and so extinction isn't such a bad thing, it's the biosphere that's evolving. It's not the species are changing all the time. And so we shouldn't make extinction disconnected as this great tragic event. No, it's part of a much, much larger cycle. In the third grade, we look at human systems and shelter and families and clans and music and ritual and trade that occur from the compression. Part of the brain, when it has to recognize faces, there's a whole development of mental complexity. And I notice this now that I'm 76 and can't instantly recall the data that I need to give a lecture, so this is the only place I give lectures anymore. You begin to lose, you remember the title of the book, but you can't remember the author. And so the reason names are the first to go, which is a poem by Billy Collins, is because we can recognize faces, because that in evolutionary terms evolved first and is much more fundamental to human consciousness. Names come in much, much later with culture. So as you get old and can't remember names, but you see their face and you say, oh yeah, what's that guy's name? You know, alas. And the fourth grade, early Neolithic systems, social systems, and we study agriculture. So here again, sustainability comes up early in the lower school. Trade and markets, which go way back. The earliest trade we have is of red ochre, and the first work of art is a piece of red ochre with the pubic delta inscribed on it in the same form as it appears in Çatalhöyük in 5800 BC. So it emerges in 77,000 BC and is still in the culture, because cultures evolve logarithmically, and religions tend to conserve things for long times and make them sacred. So in cathedrals we have candles and not fluorescent lights. So it's an element in which trade, the first thing that was important was red ochre, which was the menstrual blood of the Great Mother. And in menarche rituals in Africa, the young nubile women are covered with red. So red is a kind of cosmological echo. And so architecture, waste disposal, all of these things we look at in the lower grade. In grade 5, it's riverine civilization, and we have irrigation systems, salinization and soil loss. Grade 6, catastrophes and prophetic movements. In 1181 or so, Iceland blew up, and there was a great instability. For 8 years in Ireland, we see this from tree ring science, there were no summers. And the people are moving. The Sea Peoples are a confederation of various tribes that are displaced. There's the Bevolkerwanderung, the German word for migration of peoples into India, which used to be called the Aryan invasion. It's probably not an invasion, it's just cattle herders moving their cattle slowly from the Balkans into Afghanistan and down into India. So you have, oftentimes with catastrophes, a prophetic figure arise. You see this very clearly with Moses in the Old Testament. And so in a period of catastrophic change, whether it's earthquakes destroying Minoan civilization or the darkness and lack of food in 1181 BC in Western Europe, you have a situation of insecurity and anxiety, and a prophetic figure is given the power to rise to challenge the priesthood, who are committed to the old paradigm. So the confrontation between Moses and the Pharaoh and the priests of Egypt is a classical story of this confrontation between a prophet who is more shamanic and chosen by God or the spirits, and an institutional investiture where priests go to school and are trained how to be bureaucrats and managers of the sacred. So this confrontation is basic in the Bible, and so the Bible should be looked at as literature and very informative. In grade 7, universalizing empires and religions and the relationship between the two, the shift from gods and nature to a transcendent God, abstraction in mathematics, calligraphy, musical notation, and medieval allegory. Grade 8, trade and plagues, the shadow side of world trade, the Silk Road and the expansion of Buddhist religion into China, and the new sea routes where we look at Zheng He and his movement, maybe possibly to the Americas and the Pacific, but certainly in the Indian Ocean, and that Columbus certainly did not discover America. These large sea voyages are centuries earlier, and certainly the Vikings in Anso Meadows in Newfoundland were there around 1100, 1050, long before Columbus. So a lot of the dates are way off. And then the 9th grade, the shift to modernism, cultural ecology from world religions to a world economy, from ecclesia to economy, economics of addiction we look at, and slavery, and the pox and the plague and the collapse of Native American culture from smallpox. And so we look at that in the same way we looked at the Great Death in 8th grade. And then we'll pick up in the spiral and look at that in terms of the flu pandemic in 1919. And then 10th grade, ecological collapse, tragedy of the commons that Ralph talked about, the Irish potato famine, which is the first form of what Naomi Klein would call the shock doctrine, in which crisis management is applied to use the catastrophe in Ireland to try to restructure the society in terms of capitalism. And so the first chair of economics, Nassau Senior at Oxford at high table, ironically, said, "The trouble with the Irish plague is not enough of them died." So that whole notion of using catastrophe to change the society, whether it's the CIA and Kissinger in Pinochet's Chile, or it's the Trevelyan and the Irish famine, these structures go back to the 19th century, and they're still being performed today in foreign policies such as our own. Eisenhower is considered to be this really good guy, and we were all Eisenhower Republicans when I was a little kid, because we were escaping the political machine of Chicago. My grandfather was part of the political machine of Chicago. And the irony is he's the first president to actually sign an executive order for assassination and bring down a democratically voted in government in Nicaragua. So a lot of the nasty politics of American foreign policy, by which the world hates us with good reason, all of this comes independent of Republican and Democrat. There's a deep state, to use the phrase that was first used for study of Turkey. There's a deep state, and so we're on the surface democratic, but there's the deep state running things, and China's on the surface communist, but it has a deep state running things, and so the association of government and crime and corruption, we're converging, China and America, because we're isomorphic, really. And all the other stuff we tell ourselves is just, you know, BS. So the 11th grade, we look at economics as a dominant worldview, the Whig theory of history, the influenza plague, and study these as systems and model them according to the course that Ralph taught here. And the 12th grade, finally, we move to the meta-historical level, and we look at globalization versus planetization. Now, most people always talk in terms of globalization, the World Bank model and NAFTA and the rest of it. But we look in terms of the emergence of planetary dynamics in the science of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, who were both Lindisfarne Fellows, in the rise of ecology as the new governing science. So part of what we're experiencing now is the shift from economics as the governing science to ecology as the governing science. But we're still electing, you know, businessmen to Congress, and so we have, you know, an administration and not an opposing party of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. It's a party of obstruction. And so government has come to a standstill, and business is locked in as the metaphor and the model and the deep structure of consciousness, and it's irrelevant. The Congress is about living in the world of 100 years ago. It's not alive to what the real problems are. Then the 12th grade, we move into catastrophes again, which again is a recapitulation of stuff we've already studied. And the model of spaceship Earth, Bucky Fuller's term, versus Gaia, and climate change, death of the oceans, and the sixth extinction, all the topics for today. So you don't have to do a lot of work to find the sustainability thread in the spiral curriculum. It's there from the get-go. So this is MIT, and this is the Earth Sciences building. My office was in this building. And there are these 4 pylons, and so the Earth Science building strides the world like a colossus, to use Shakespeare's phrase. And because it's on pylons, the wind off the Charles would flow in with such force that the secretaries, when they came to work, could not open the doors. Now, this building is designed by I.M. Pei, a Chinese, who, if anybody should have understood feng shui, which literally in Chinese means wind and water. But after building this thing, what did he do? He built the Hancock Insurance Building, where the glass windows were blown up by the wind and fell on the pedestrians below. So this is a model of the domination of nature. This is the Lindisfarne Fellows House in Crestone, Colorado, which I and Sim van der Rijn is called by the New York Times the Dean of Green Architecture in America. He's in his 80s now, so he's, you know, coming to the finishing of his career. This is at about 8,000 feet. This is where Courtney came to visit me when we first met. And this mountain, Kit Carson, is 14,300 feet. So it's a spectacular environment. So when I was designing the Fellows House with Sim, I said, look, at MIT, the building was imposed on nature, and the model was man dominates nature, which literally happened to me. I was walking down the main corridor going to Mass Ave at MIT, and I was complaining about the education of engineers creating the ecological crisis. This is 1967. And a student ahead of me had heard, grad student I think he was a little older, and he turned around to me, having heard my conversation. You don't understand. I didn't come here, you know, to study nature. I came here to dominate nature. So, I mean, if I was looking for a straw man, I didn't have to look very far. So I said to Sim, I want the building to be immanent and in nature and not on it. So we decided for a earth-bermed house. This has a sod roof. It's built into the hillside, and these are the rocks taken right from the land itself. And these are built in slip form and not in traditional stone-by-stone masonry. So this is where the Lindisfarne Fellows would get together to discuss the environment, as we had been in our meetings out here in Southampton in 1974 and 5, when Jonas Salk and Gregory Bateson would attend the meetings, and we would talk about global change, you know, the greenhouse effect, all of these things. And rather than the culture listening to us, we had Reagan and then 2 Bushes, and Clinton wasn't that environmental. So the culture basically said, no, we're not interested in you, and went on into hyper-capitalism rather than just you know, traditional industrial capitalism. So I get to say, I told you so. So here you get a good sense of how in situ. So this is where, you know, we can go. When Lawrence Rockefeller was one of our major patrons and was a good friend of Courtney's, and when I was talking about wanting to go electric, it pays not to be too far ahead of the curve. My whole career has been based on being so far ahead of the curve that I could never really profit from anything I was talking, thinking, or doing. So I'm, you know, the great loser in the system of winners and losers. But he said, no, let's not put in solar electricity yet. Let's get the structure there so we can take in retreatants, and I would run conferences for college professors there, and get the people in and then retrofit back into solar. And I think that was the right advice that Lawrence gave me, because all the solar collectors I put on here in 1980s technology could not handle the pulse of 50 below zero at 3 in the morning to 50 above 0 Fahrenheit in the afternoon. And so all the pipes in the water cracked and the system failed. And in human failure, I had designed it to be kind of like a hypercaust system where here's the greenhouse for passive solar, and the floor had pipes in for radiant slab. But they made the mistake of not wrapping the pipes. My, you know, construction man was kind of a, you know, a converted hippie from Findhorn. So there was a big error, and so the whole heating system failed. And we have a radiant slab in the Lindisfarne Chapel, another building that I designed and worked with a different architect, Keith Critchlow. So if you're there too early, but now we're not too early, and things are much, much cheaper. So in the dorms and the next step for Ross, I think we could create, you know, a very green campus that's, you know, that's less energy intensive, say, than this building is. So I think, you know, Courtney asked for where do we go from here. I think this is where we go from here. Here's Sim van der Rijn years ago at Lindisfarne in Manhattan on the corner of 20th and 6th. Here's John Todd in biological design. And here's the English architect from London, Sacred Architecture, Keith Critchlow. And so they're discussing how to apply sacred geometry to biological design to architecture. And here is the meeting of Maury Strong, who donated the campus and the land to us. He created, after the Stockholm Conference of '68, created the United Nations Environmental Program and insisted it be in Nairobi and not Geneva. And here's the economist who was talking about guaranteed annual income and things like that in the '70s. And she was instrumental in creating the Clean Air Act. And so there's a picture of President Lyndon Johnson handing the signed bill to Hazel, because she had instigated through her Institute of the Futures in Princeton this whole environmental legal movement. And here is a model of the Lindisfarne Hamlet that John Todd had created and was explaining to the fellows. These beams, vigas here, are giant, but they were dead trees killed by beetles. And so we used resources from the San Juan Mountains that we didn't have to cut down the trees. So we tried as much as possible to create a small footprint. Here's John Todd's model using a wall that has all the infrastructure of pipes and water and heating, and the buildings hung off it in solar, and a wall enclosure, because in our site we have bears and mountain lions and deer who would just eat out the whole garden overnight. And so you have to have a wall or a high fence. So this kind of integrative agriculture and biological design is certainly something that we could do at Ross. Here is a sewage plant. Now notice the people are not complaining of the stink. They're walking right through it. This is a biological system. I brought John Todd and a group of the Lindisfarne Fellows to the Findhorn spiritual community in northern Scotland, close to Inverness. And out of that, the community decided to build a living machine and a sewage treatment plant. And so it's a chain of being where anaerobic bacteria, root systems, begin to digest the pollutants and do it without chemicals. It's a totally natural system of turning highly polluted water into potable water. And so this exists in Findhorn, Scotland. Here's Sim van der Rijn at one of our last Lindisfarne, the next to last Lindisfarne Fellows Conference, talking about the solar village. And I had written in my 1977 book, The Meta-Industrial Village, where nature would be scaled down and, culture and machines would be scaled down and nature would be scaled up. Unfortunately, what happened, I thought, and here's where I was really, really wrong, I thought electronics would help us miniaturize human systems and maximize natural systems. What happened was the World Wide Web, the internet, and all these clouds that are not clouds, they're clusters of air-conditioned machines that are intensely energy consumptive. So we're now consuming more energy because of electronics rather than less. So I was completely naive. Now here's a stinking canal in Baima, China. I mean, this is just really a cesspool, and it's odoriferous and awful. John creates rafts for lakes and rafts where the root systems of the plant can begin to digest the pollutants and clear the system. He introduces crayfish and creates a kind of miniaturization of an evolutionary progression from snails up to fish. And now in this canal in Baima, China, you can walk the raft, there's no odor, and fish have returned to the canal. So here's kind of ribbons of green that you can have in cities, and John has, in his book, shown how you could do this for Manhattan. Our Lindisfarne Fellows, Paul Mankiewicz, has shown how to Mayor Bloomberg, how you could put oyster beds around Manhattan Island and do all these things to change the ecology, put liverwort moss on the side of buildings instead of air conditioning. There are all these biological solutions that we were discussing 30 and 40 years ago. And Courtney's contribution, which the fellows really loved, was she said, Bill, you don't have the younger generation here. You've got some undergraduates like my own kids, but you don't have, the very young high school kids, so let me bring some. So they brought David Kramer and Sylvia Channing, and the fellows absolutely loved their contribution and their presence, so it really was a great suggestion. And this guy I think you've seen, and this is his wife, Ray. So where we could go with the dorms, instead of these energy-intensive houses we use for the international students, this is the guitar house, solar house, designed by Sim van der Rijn. We could create dorms or residential houses or complex them and make them solar and make them a model of walking the talk and showing, exactly the new paradigm in operation with a green campus. And because we are in the Hamptons traditionally an artistic society, we don't have to adopt these Danish and Hawaiian windmills. In California, I've seen them too, that are, 10 stories high and are very high impact on the environment. We could give commissions to artists like Richard Serra or De Subero to make not just statuary like the one we have here at the Tennis Academy, but have them sculptures and energy-producing windmills at the same time, and offer a prize or a commission for the best design, and then choose things to create wind energy as well as solar. So my point is that environmentalism and all these issues are implicate in the for 20 years in the spiral curriculum, so you don't have to do a lot of work of thinking of units to bring it in. And we're right at the edge of the recreation of Ross. We finished one generation of 20 years now with the complex dynamical system of Courtney and Ralph and me in that chronological order. And so now we're at a new place, and I think we need to not just revise, but revision. Thank you.